All right, Alexander, let's do the Q&A from the live stream with Dima from the Military Summary channel. Let's start things off with MDE, who says, I had the thought the other day, what if the U.S. deep state is pushing Russia and China together to secure MIC business model for the future?
Well, possibly, but how does that help the US? It doesn't seem to me that that helps the US. I mean, it might be very good for the MIC, but from the point of view of the US as a whole, it's not such a good idea. And if the deep state really is behaving in that kind of fashion, well, I think that's practically treasonous. I mean, actually creating alliances in order to help one, fatten out the profits of one particular part of the US at the risk of its entire global geopolitical position. That doesn't seem to me like a good bargain. Actually, I don't think that. I've just been reading a report that the US government has been trying to get Xi Jinping to take a phone call from Biden, and that they've been trying to do it for 5 weeks, and that the Chinese are refusing the call. So I don't think that that's actually what the deep state wants, what you said. But, there we go. If they do want it, as I said, they should all be arrested because they're acting against US interests. I'd say it's virtually treason.
Yeah, from Meg Galucci, thank you for that super sticker. Jean Judy 1111, thank you for that super sticker. Ralph, thank you for that super chat. Valley S, thank you for that super sticker. Elena Diaz says, how will Ukraine and Russia reconcile after the war? Would a trial against Zelensky help?
It might do. Now, I'm just going to say this. You never quite know what's going to happen. And remember, there was this very bitter conflict in the Caucasus throughout the 1990s and 2000s between the Russians and the Chechens. And many people said that the Chechens would never forgive or forget the Russians, and the Russians would never reconcile with the Chechens. And they did reconcile, and they reconciled completely. And one of the reasons was that the Chechens figured out that they'd been used, and their anger became refocused and redirected against the West. And I can easily imagine that with Ukraine something like that might happen again. And maybe a trial of Zelensky might clear the air, but we'll see what happens there.
From Far, thank you for that super chat. Tatiana Carmichael, thank you for that super sticker. Dominique says, one is stunned the West doesn't see the incongruity of condemning Putin when we see the incessant wars waged by the U.S., including in Iraq, Ukraine, and the prosecution of the anti-war crimes hero Assange.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that. I entirely agree. And can I just say, of course, in the West, the official governments don't want us to see that. The media doesn't want us to see that. But around the world, many, many people are seeing it. I mean, around the world, this decision of the ICC has not been well received.
From Custard Pie, thank you for that super sticker. Level 42, thank you for that super sticker. Summer of 1970, thank you for that super sticker. Commander Crossfire says, I really hope Russia liberates the whole of Ukraine for the sake of the Ukrainian people and humanity, but I fear they will not. Thanks for your videos.
You may very well be right. I've come to share your feeling, by the way.
From Angry Warhawk, if NATO is dissolved, what will happen in Europe?
We will all, the world life will continue and get better. NATO is a cause of war and instability in Europe. Without NATO, we may have a real prospect of peace.
Lada Moreau says, how did the HIMARS show that it's a weaponry system to invest in? Sorry, but I draw a completely different conclusion. It's too expensive and ineffective.
I completely agree with you. I don't agree with Dima on this. I mean, with you on this one. I think the HIMARS had a brief period of a couple of weeks when they were making a certain impact. I think the Russians quickly figured out how to respond to it. and I think its effectiveness declined steeply. And I also think that it is too expensive. I think it's too expensive and too complicated for what it does.
Level 42, thank you for that super chat. Tyler Durden says, Ukraine is just a testing ground. Sorry, but this is way too simplistic.
I have to say I agree with you also. I understand Dima's points, and I'm sure it is in part being used as a testing ground. But, well, I mean, I've discussed it many times. Alex has discussed it many times. There are many discussions on the Duran. The explanations for the war and the reason why the war is being continued are more complicated than that. Though, nonetheless, just to say, there is a lot of validity in the points Dima is making. But I do think it is too simple an explanation, as you do.
Ken Wiltshire says, I love this trio. John Ashley Smith says, what about the construction of a rumored 3 new army corps in Western Ukraine? Any scuttlebutt on that?
Well, I think Dima discussed this. That. I mean, I think that there is some talk.
That,
I think he did,
Yeah. Singrid Natalia says, Dima, thank you for all the info. Do you think it's possible a dirty bomb is tried in Belarus? How would Russia react?
Let's hope he answered that one too, yes. Mm-hmm.
He answered that one as well. Richard Law Bitster says, how about the U.S. assassinates Zelensky and tries to blame it on Russia? What effect might that have on the dynamic of the situation?
Well, it might happen. I mean, that Zelensky might find himself dead at some point, and it might even happen in the way that you say. I don't think it would be as in quite the way that you describe. But, you know, if we are in that kind of situation, in those sort of scenarios, then I think the situation in Ukraine from a US point of view would have become very, very desperate indeed. And I'm not going to look so far ahead as to try to explain exactly what's going to happen in that kind of scenario, which is for the moment hypothetical. But, you know, things like that do happen. They have happened in war and in other situations. And I've talked about how the United States certainly was partly responsible for the murder of President Diem in South Vietnam in 1963.
Okay, Zeshan, thank you for that super sticker. Eileen Gibson, thank you for that super sticker. Adil Farid, thank you for that super chat. Radovid, thank you for that super sticker. Milton Neal, thank you for that super sticker. Lada Moreau says, I sincerely apologize to the guest, but in all honesty, I prefer to listen to Brian Berletic with regards to weaponry used in Ukraine, Russia, SMO.
Well, we all have our different views. Brian has his. I have mine, and Dima also has his. And, you know, you listen and you are entitled to prefer whom you wish. And obviously that's, you're right.
Level 42 says, how much losses the Ukraine forces can afford before they start crumbling?
Not an answer I think we can all safely give. The one thing I will say is this. There's now an overwhelming consensus right across the Western media, Western commentators, Western military sources, that the Ukrainian army is now heavily degraded as compared with the force it was when the war began. That most of the professional soldiers and the best officers have either been wounded or killed and are no longer fit for combat. So that's all I'm going to say. I read a report recently discussed on my channel, my own channel, from somebody called Spengler in Asia Times, who said that it's not that Ukraine is running out of men, it's running out of trained men, or properly trained men, and that there is really no solution to this problem.
Sancho Relaxo says, Cameco, Canada's biggest uranium company, second in the world, has a massive deal with Ukraine. It'll provide all of Ukraine's nuclear fuel for 2024 to 36. So who will get Zaporozhye matters to Trudeau big time?
Oh, I'm sure it does, yeah. I mean, matters to Zelensky. I mean, the nuclear power plant is clearly going to be a major objective of whatever offensive Ukraine eventually launches in Zaporozhye. Of that, there's no doubt at all.
Angry Warhawk says, great stream as always. Thank you to whoever sent the super chat a few weeks ago recommending my channel.
Right.
Thank you, Angry Warhawk, for that. Z12IT says, will the VVS go to attack the Ukro accumulations?
The VVS, for those who don't know, is the Russian Air Force. In fact, I believe it's no longer called the VVS. That was its old name. It's called something else now. But anyway, yes, I'm sure it will. And we are seeing more and more signs now that the Russian Air Force is operating over Ukrainian skies. It's still acting rather tentatively, but it's bombing Ukrainian positions in Avdiivka and in Sumy. Sumy is in the north of Ukraine, not far from Kiev. Kiev is supposed to have the best air defense system in Ukraine, but it's not. Those air defenses are not able to stop Russian fighters bombing positions in Sumy, which suggests that the Ukrainian air defense system is heavily depleted. So I think that means that when Ukrainian troops do start to concentrate, that happens only just before an offensive begins, then you will see the Russian Air Force spring into action.
A different perspective says, what happens in one economy should not break another. That's a broken system. How can you assist me while actively being the system trying to destroy me?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I mean, but that's the consequence of globalization. Globalization has made everybody interconnected. And that's why we are in the situation which we are in. Some countries, Russia, China perhaps to some extent, are plugged, well, not China to anything like the same extent, but some countries are trying to opt out of the system. But fundamentally, that's the problem.
Zionic, thank you for that super sticker. Sparky says, great work, fellas. Lada Moreau says, how can Ukraine unblock forces in Bakhmut if every road going to the city is under artillery control of Russians? Looks like a suicide mission.
Yes, I agree with that. And I have to say this, over the last couple of days, the talk of a Ukrainian counterattack has faded. And we're making this program on the 28th of March. The latest comments from General Sirski, who is the ground forces commander by Ukraine, suggests that if they were thinking of a counterattack, they've now abandoned that idea.
Mitchell Bison, thank you for that super sticker. Hank Kuning, thank you for that super sticker. Yov Bressler, thank you for that super chat. Hank, thank you for that super sticker. Level 42 says, what about the Poles taking part or send an expedition force to Ukraine? Would the Russians take this as a declaration of war and attack Poland?
Well, who knows? On my own view, probably not. I actually believe, and I really do believe this, I think that the general sentiment in Russia on the part of the political leadership is that one day they still hope, this may sound strange, but I think that this is their view, that they might be able eventually to win Poland over. And I think that's what they'll prefer to do. So I think that they calculate that if the Polish army marches into Ukraine, the Russians will have little difficulty dealing with it. It's now stripped itself of much of its best equipment, many of its best troops. Its officers are unhappy. It's the people in Poland probably wouldn't welcome this. They'll defeat the Polish army in Ukraine, and that will put them in a much stronger position at that point to bargain with whatever new Polish government appears. I think that is the Russian strategy. And I've been following a lot of comments by Russians about Poland, and that's what I think their strategy is.
Tabernak says, one gains access to a 1 million-man volunteer army and industrial support. The other receives the nuclear deterrence required to sink a few ships or fleets.
I'm not quite sure who you're discussing. I don't believe Ukraine's army is anywhere close to 1 million men. Let me say that straight away. I think that a much more plausible number is around 200 to 250,000.
Yeah, I think maybe this is Russia, China.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay. Well,
Maybe.
you may be right. Well, if so, then let's be absolutely clear about this. The military resources of the Russians and the Chinese taken together are enormous, and they dwarf those of the West. And there's a commentary by a Chinese journalist, very, very important Chinese journalist called Hu Xichin, who's now actually coming out and saying it. If the West can't outproduce Russia in ammunition and military equipment, what hope does it have against China?
Yeah. From Celso7, thank you for that. Super chat. Rue Sports says, it's going to be a very good day since it's Coffee Break Tuesday. Thank you for that, Rue Sport. Olskov says, Russia cannot fight NATO alone long term. Iran, China, Syria need to start contributing men to the fight. How does this necessity eventually come about?
Well, that begs the question of how long term is long term. You're talking about the Russian strategy of attrition war. So far, it's working in Russia's favor. They're outproducing the West in shells. They're outproducing the West in tanks. They're causing unsustainable losses to Ukraine. The Western powers can't keep up, and the Russians are suffering far fewer losses than Ukraine is. So for the moment, I think that it's working out well for them. And actually, I don't think they want huge numbers of volunteers flooding into the country from abroad, because I think that's difficult to organise and control. There was some talk of it, if you remember, right at the beginning of the war. Shoigu seemed to be in favour of it, or rather Putin seemed to be in favour of it, but I don't think the Russian military is at all keen. So for the moment, I don't think this is what's going to happen. And I think that the Russians feel that the war of attrition is working out well for them.
From Hunger the Die Merchant, with all the diplomatic initiatives in the Middle East, could Greece be peeled off the West into a deal with Turkey? What would Turkey, Russia, or China have to offer to entice Greece?
Not with our present political class. It's as simple as that. I think Alex would... I don't know what Alex's views are, but I cannot imagine our present political class taking that kind of decision.
Yeah. Either left or right, Alex.
Absolutely. I mean, the left
doesn't matter.
The so-called left, the left, Syriza is absolutely as pro-Western, pro-EU, pro-American as the right is.
Yeah. Sandrandis says superb insights, and Sandrandis also says again superb insights. Thank you for that. Ignaki says Western banking interests are also represented in the conflict. Agricultural land investments, munitions, and telecommunications are just a few. How can Ukraine approach a peace agreement in light of its Western indebtedness?
Oh, well, I mean, it can just default on its debts. Many countries have done that. And, you know, those options are always there. I mean, do bear in mind, if Ukraine defaults on its debts to the West, it would still probably get a lot of financial support from the Chinese and the Russians. They wouldn't be deterred from helping Ukraine rebuild itself if Ukraine defaulted in that kind of way. Because, of course, the Russians and the Chinese will not approve of these Western loans and these debts that Ukraine is taking. I don't think that's a problem, actually. I don't think that's any kind of problem. The point is, Ukraine, or at least the leadership in Ukraine, has no political will to achieve peace. And besides, the people who run things in Kiev, they are now so connected to the West that they couldn't break away from the West even if they wanted to. But that is not true of Ukraine as a country.
Piratefish says, how much weaponry might NATO still add to this conflict? We hear how there is serious shortages, but wonder.
Well, this is, of course, the question, and there are many people in Russia who are going around saying, don't believe this, all this talk about, you know, the West being out of ammunition, the West being out of tanks. This isn't true. It really isn't true. It's just misinformation. And it's possible I mean, I'm not going to say that is entirely implausible, but I don't think so. There's just too much commentary about this now coming from too many sources and from too many people who one would doubt would be saying those things. So I was reading today that France is going to increase its supplies of shells to Ukraine from 1,000 a day to 2,000 a day. Ukraine fires between 1,000 a day to 1,000 a month to 2,000 a month.
2,000.
France is going to increase supplies of shells to 2,000 rounds a month. A month! That's less than half of the amount of shells that Ukraine fires in a day. So, I think that kind of statistic says it all, and I don't think these are deceptions.
Yeah. From Paul Walker, thank you for that super chat. Summer of 1970 says knowledge is power, and the Duran is the best at sharing that knowledge and power. Thanks. Thank you for that. Elena Diaz says, Dima, how is the morale among civilians and military in Ukraine? Do you know? Same question about Russia.
I think Dima answered this actually.
In
Russia, certainly, my impression is consolidated and high. There's one, just to come back to Russia very quickly, there's one very clear indication that morale in Russia last year was high, which is that life expectancy grew by 3 years. 3 years. Highest jump, apparently, since the end of the Second World War. It's now around 73 years, which is less than in the West, but by Russian standards, it's a leap in life expectancy. Now, that suggests that people are in a better mood, that they're drinking less, which is one of the reasons why, when the morale fell after the Soviet Union collapsed, there was heavy drinking, men were drinking, and that was caused life expectancy to fall. Life expectancy rises. It's an indication that morale is strong. And I've heard reports that birth rate rose in Russia last year as well.
Sparky says, depleted uranium is very dense and heavy, so a small projectile can act as a large one. The legacy sickness is an unfortunate and horrible side effect.
Yes, I think we touched on that in the program, and you're absolutely right.
T-Tom says, where are the greens on depleted uranium? Just look into it. 1999.
Well, I'm going to say this. What we've discovered over the course of the last year is that the Greens don't give a toss about the environment. I say that straightforwardly because the Greens that I remember from the 1980s, people like Petra Kelly, General Bastian, those sorts of people, they'd have been up in arms. Not up in arms, they would be furious about the Nord Stream business, about the depleted uranium supplies, those sort of things. But the current Greens, Greta and co and all the others, they don't care about things like this. And that tells you what that, I think, has outed them. We can now see them for what they actually are, which is an anti-Russian, anti-industry, globalist faction party, nothing to do with the environment at all.
Maria S., thank you for that super sticker. Tim Gibson, thank you for that super sticker. Jeff Bickford says, thank you. Elena Diaz says, why don't Russia throw the UK ambassador out from Russia?
We discussed this over the course of the program. Mm-hmm.
Ricardo Alfonso says, if NATO can barely produce regular shells, how many depleted uranium shells could they produce?
Well, it's a different technology, and I think they can produce some. But, Putin says that the Russians have far more of these sorts of shells as well. It's a pretty ominous thought, actually, but there we go.
A different perspective says, we include all U.S. personnel as our fighting force, reservists, cooks, etc. How do we match up against Russia's reserve? Wagner. Average off versus def jugger.
Well, I'm not going to
I
speculate
think
about these
Dima
things.
answered this.
I think he
Yeah,
did, yes.
he did answer this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sonia, thank you for that super sticker. Marcus Brennan says, Part 1, will Poland enter this, and will Russia if they take the West? Part 2, will Russia one day seek revenge on Britain's navy for their role in assisting Ukraine to sink their flagship?
Well, can I just answer the second question, which is I hope not. I think that from the Russian point of view, revenge really achieves very little. Win the war, defeat Ukraine, and then maybe, just possibly, this hysteria we've seen in Britain will start to abate, and then Russian interests are not served by revenge, which will simply create a cycle of revenge and counter-revenge. Rather, see what you can do with the British, and whether eventually you can wean them away from this bizarre outlook that people in Britain have. Seeking revenge will simply reinforce the hostility in Britain that is already there. Just saying those things. About Poland, I think I've already answered that question. I think that the Poles are crazy enough to march into Ukraine. The Russians will deal with them there. And unlike Britain, I think they will seek to win Poland over. And I think they might achieve some success in that.
Kateri Strobel, thank you for that super chat. Bostian, thank you for that super sticker. Chinto for real says, what will happen to Galicia and Carpathia?
Very good question.
Dima answered that, actually.
Yeah, I
That's a
think he
good
did,
question.
yeah.
Do you want to say this?
Yeah. No, I don't want to say. I mean, I will wait and see. But as I said, Dima gave his view, which is that the Russians won't go there, and it's Dima was our guest. I'm not going to argue with that, actually.
Okay. Sparky says, many Ukrainians are victims of post-Cold War anti-Russian NATO propaganda. I hope they realize that now.
I think personally that when this is all over and Ukraine is defeated, you will see a pendulum swing in Ukraine. I think a lot of people in Ukraine will feel very angry and very betrayed at what was done to them and to their country by the way it's been used by the West.
Dimitri says, how has NATO proven itself? From what I've seen, it's a colossal failure. Inferior missile potential, industrial capacity, air defense, artillery, and no UAV parity. This guy should stick to maps.
Well, I think it's a bit hard on Dima, actually. But your perspective is not so different from what Hu Xinxin, that Chinese commentator I was talking about, has said. He's basically saying the West can't outproduce Russia. Then they're not that strong after all. They are, from a Chinese perspective, they're starting to look a bit like a paper tiger. That was a very interesting commentary, actually.
Ricardo Alfonso says there are still some Russian banks using SWIFT.
Yes,
there are.
Yes, there are, absolutely. But the central bank has now forbidden them from using SWIFT for transactions inside Russia itself.
Yeah. And Austria's working to, or at least the EU is pressuring Raiffeisen, which is the one bank which does use SWIFT to exit. Yes. They're getting a lot of pressure.
Yes.
Sparky says, is it possible Russia reabsorb Ukraine? It was Russia until 1954. Then Russia won't need a puppet government since Ukraine will be Russia.
I think Dima answered that question. Just to give one little, just one little correction. Of course, Ukraine, most of Ukraine, apart from Galicia, was part of the Russian Empire until 1917. Then most of Ukraine, apart from Galicia, was part of the Soviet Union. The Soviets created a Soviet Republic of Ukraine, which was part of the Soviet Union. What they transferred to Ukraine in 1954 was Crimea, which up to that time had been part of the Russian Republic. It was transferred in 1954 for reasons never fully explained to Ukraine.
Well, I don't want to get too into this, but
No.
they say it was because of sentimental reasons, wasn't it, Alex?
Yeah, well, Khrushchev, who was the Soviet leader at that time, was from Ukraine. Probably that was the major reason.
That's
from
what
the
I've read.
Donbass.
That's what I've heard.
That's what I've heard. Yeah.
I don't know how true that is, but maybe. Frankie Boy says, here's a stupid question. Where was the ICC when the US used depleted uranium tank rounds at Fallujah? Where's the ICC now with the UK sending them?
Well, you're completely right. It's a very good question. And people around the world are going to be asking lots of those sorts of questions.
Dean Jones, thank you for that super sticker. Peter Sugleris says, what do you guys think will happen to Odessa?
All right. Well, my own personal view, and again, Dima gave his own perspective, that one day it'll be this happy place where all the nationalities and people will mix and there will be different flags. I still believe, and I've believed this all along, and I still maintain it, that I cannot imagine this operation ending, this war ending, especially, provided the Russians achieve a victory, which I expect they will, without the Russians re-establishing control over Odessa. I just can't imagine any other outcome to this war than that from a Russian point of view.
Okay, says, I got here late. All I can do is wish Dima a quick 100,000 subscribers. He is the only one who ends his videos with the consequent touch of humanity.
Yeah. Well, I am not the only one, but certainly he does end them with that, yeah.
Thank you for that. Transport says, my favorite comment on the Duran, when you say these people have no reverse gear. My friend had a car that couldn't go in reverse. I can predict these people's future.
True enough. Yeah.
Very good.
I think over the course of the last year, I'm sorry to say this actually, as the person who coined that phrase, but I think over the course of the last year, I hope people have seen the extent to which that is true.
Yeah. That's a great phrase.
Yeah.
Coined here. Coined by Alexander.
Yeah.
As is the escalation escalator.
Escalation.
Say that fast 3 times.
3 times.
Dmitry says, Wagner Bakhmut pause is a shift to Avdiivka, while at the same time delivering a massive strike on the energy grid, knowing UAF can't really respond in the mud and force a split deblockade operation.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there, and I'm not going to unpack it all because I think there's some valid points. I don't think that Wagner forces were relocated to Avdiivka. There might have been some, more emphasis given to Avdiivka, and that might have reduced shell supplies to the Wagner forces, and that might have conceivably had some effect in some of all those ructions that we were hearing about. But the word I'm getting at the moment is that fighting in Bakhmut itself has been extremely intense, and that the Russians are making big progress inside Bakhmut. I say big progress, not in terms of kilometers, but in steadily gaining more and more control of Bakhmut. And over the last few hours, it's been confirmed that they've controlled now the giant Azom factory, which is this big factory in Bakhmut, which is one of the most important locations in the town.
Sparky says, Dima, thanks for your insight. Jinto for real, thank you for that super sticker. Chuck Galas says, thank you for that super sticker. Elza says, that will be a great history book that Dima describes. Some will remain in history as clowns. And Chuck Skalak says, hey you. Thank you for that super sticker. And that is everything. Thank you to all of your questions and super chats for the live stream with Military Summary Channel.
Thanks.